Uh, the Xi government in China has become ossified. It's a cult of personality that is tighter than any we've ever seen before, including the Kim dynasty in North Korea. And there is no one who wants to bring Xi any information, not information that they think will make him mad, any information at all. And
Mhm.
so he's making a series of bad and increasingly disconnected from reality decisions. But it's the Ukraine war that I think has really changed the calculus. The Chinese use the Russians as kind of a canary when they're thinking of doing something. They let the Russians do it first, see how it comes out. So like the liberalization in the 1980s is a great example. They saw perestroika and glasnost in action. It led to the fall of the Soviet Union. They're like, whoa, we're not doing that. And it's happening with the Ukraine war. So number one, they thought the war would be easy. Uh, but you can walk to Kiev. You'd have to swim to Taipei. And Kiev has only been preparing for this war for 8 years. Taiwan has been preparing for 45. So, like, okay, this is going to be a harder war than we thought. Assumption number two, we assume that Russian weapons are really good. And so they cloned Russian weapons for most of their military buildout. And now they have massive buyers or theft remorse, whatever you want to call it. Assumption two is gone. Assumption three,
Little Freudian slip there, huh?
yeah, exactly. Uh, Assumption three was that no one will sanction Russia because it's too important to the international economy. Well, whoops. And say what you will about the Russian economy, it's a massive exporter of energy and food products, whereas China is the largest importer of both. If you cut off China from international food supplies and the things that go into fertilizer and fuel, they will deindustrialize in under a year and a half and probably have 500 million people suffering from famine. That's the end of China as a modern industrialized power. But I think the thing that scared them the most were the boycotts. Most of the restrictions on operations in Russia were not done by governments. It was individual companies saying, we don't want to be a part of this. And that is the entire Chinese development model. So every assumption that they have made for the last 40 years to prepare for Taiwan has been proven laughably wrong. They've got to start over. And it's not clear in a one man cult of personality government that that's even theoretically possible. So yeah, I think Taiwan's going to be okay.
Hmm.
Well, let's start with eugenics. There was a lot of things we didn't understand about population policy when that existed, and so leaving aside the racism and the "I get to play God in your life" angles of that, which I would frown upon,
Mhm.
uh, we were we were sterilizing people who had genetic conditions, thinking that made a difference. Things like bad eyesight in Sweden, for example. And so I would argue that our science had not yet cut up to what some bureaucrat thought was a brilliant idea. And the damage that we did to ourselves across the world was not minor. As to the competition, if that's the word you want to use, between the advanced world and parts of the rest of the world that we're, maybe less than enthused of at the moment, I am not too concerned about that. Well, let me rephrase that. I am concerned in a very different way. Um, you are correct in that for the most part, birth rates in the Middle East have not dropped, but it's not because these areas have industrialized or built up their agricultural system. It's because they've been living on resource rents and they're able to import what they need from the advanced world in order to feed themselves and have basic technology. Well, basic technology, that sounded wrong. In order to enjoy an industrial lifestyle without actually industrializing,
Mhm.
which means if you break down globalization and transport, most of them are fucked because they don't have the capacity to supply themselves and they are utterly dependent upon civilian levels of security on the high seas in order to generate the income that they need to buy what they want. And if that breaks down, they don't just have a birth rate correction, they have a population correction because these guys import on average more than half of their foodstuffs. I have
And
no doubt that in a world of economic stress that the Europeans will act like Europeans. There are very limited routes that you can get in. And if the Europeans decide that their culture is under serious threat, they will dust off some older policies and do what they do best. And it'll be ugly. And we will have significant famine across most of the Middle East. I'm not so worried about Algeria and Morocco. They have more advanced systems. This isn't not where the migrants are coming from, and they have decent trade relations. Libya is probably going to be occupied by the end of this. Egypt will be terrifying. Egypt, if it switched all of its farmland to wheat, it still can't feed its population. So you're looking at losing at least a third of the population, assuming climate change doesn't cause a problem, assuming they can still import the fertilizers that they need. Saudi Arabia is probably going to enter into a de facto military pact with an outside power who will provide them with food in exchange for oil. And you might see echoes of that in places like Kuwait or the UAE. But overall, I think we're going to see a lot less resource exports from the overall region. And that means we're going to have population adjustments. Um, for the last decade or two, this transmigration issue has been an interesting test case because we've seen how the Europeans have responded to it in a period of physical security and economic growth. You remove those two pillars, and the Europeans are going to act differently. And honestly, so are the Turks on the way, and so are the Moroccans. So, will we have a refugee move? Yeah, and it'll be stopped cold. And then we're going to have some significant population adjustments in a number of places. I was actually be more concerned about the Russians in Central Asia because there are fewer barriers, there are no good choke points, the level of desperation will be higher, and the Russian state on the backside of this war is likely to be much weaker. I think you're going to see what you're concerned about. I think you're just concerned about the wrong part of the world.
What's coming?
Sure. So there's really no foreign power that thinks it's a good idea to mess around in Mexico anymore. You know, independent of the fact that the Mexicans have an order of magnitude more internal capacity now than they did a century ago. Mexico is absolutely its own thing, and since it and the United States are each other's top trading partner in most categories, people realize that if you mess with Mexico, you mess with the United States. We are in the process of kind of extending that mindset over the rest of Central America and the Caribbean sans Cuba. And in a world where the Chinese and the Russians are obsessed with local issues, I really do think Cuba is going to come in from the cold and we'll have a broadly productive relationship, and they kind of join the NAFTA family, if you will. The opportunities there for manufacturing are actually quite impressive. That just leaves South America. And people forget that South America is not one thing. You've got your northern tier of Colombia and Venezuela, which are separated from one another but have Caribbean frontage. We already have a free trade deal with Colombia, and we're in the early stages of seeing their integration into NAFTA structures. Ecuador, Peru, and Chile are separated from everyone else by the Himalayas. We already have a free trade deal with the Chileans, and relations with the Peruvians are reasonable. Ecuador is kind of its own thing. The only place where you can get integration within the region is the southern cone of Brazil, Argentina, and the Guays. But Brazil is dependent upon international trade. Argentina is not. So we can have that part of the world, which is further from us than Europe, kind of go its own way. And as long as we keep foreign powers from using the Western Hemisphere as a foothold, this is an easy carry. One of the reasons that the Monroe Doctrine worked, even though we didn't have a functional Navy at the time, the Western Hemisphere is a long haul from the Eastern Hemisphere's land masses, especially when you're talking about places like Japan or Europe that are far north instead of far south. So we can build out a system where we incrementally expand the economic orbit of NAFTA to countries that are willing and eager, I might add.